selling just starts with the fact that it's just a series of conversations. You're having a conversation with somebody else to determine if it makes sense for you to have another conversation. It's not a one-way, interrogation. It is not a, hey, let me show you the product right away. It's like, no, we're going to have a conversation about your world. And in a conversation, what happens? There are gives and takes, right? You ask a question, you share some information, you ask another question, whatever it may be. But that, if you take that perspective, you realize like selling is actually not that hard because I talk to people every day. I talk to people all the time, even if you're an introvert, like you and I both tend to be.
Yep.
I think the important thing is in every single interaction, just always remember this. You're trying to do 3 things in every single interaction. And I want you to always check in with yourself and go, did I accomplish these 3 things after each interaction that I had? First, I'm just trying to build a connection. What are you doing to build a connection to feel like, you're kind of in lockstep with this person? In addition, what are you doing? What did you do to demonstrate some level of credibility? Because guess what? I need to know that you know what the hell you're talking about. And third, how did you showcase any sort of empathy? Meaning, how did you show that you get me, that you understand me? And in every interaction, I want you to be thinking and be mindful of like, what did you do? And did you accomplish this? Rate yourself on each one of these.
Can I real
after
quick?
Each interaction. Yeah.
Let me pause for a second, just build a connection. Because for those people who are not self-aware, quite frankly, right? Like they think they did a good job, right? They asked the right questions because they got badged in boot camp for those things. So they walk through the process. And the client's sitting there doing what they do. They nod their head. They go, yep, that sounds great. Cool. Are there some indicators for you that show that you can look for, that you say you built a connection? Like you actually connected with this person. You didn't just kind of go through. I mean, I know you and I can feel that, right? Like based on 27 years on my end, too, it's like, I can feel that I made a connection with somebody, and it's not fake rapport building shit. It's like, you know what? I got the head nods, but there's more to it than that. Are there signals you look for as far as building a connection?
I would say this. I would say focus more on demonstrating credibility and showing empathy. And as you do that, you're going to build a connection. Building a connection takes time. Yeah. It is not rapport building. And to your point, it is not like, oh, I see you went to the University of Oregon. I see you're a Boston Bruins fan. I see that's like scratching the surface of building a connection, but it's not a real connection. What builds a real connection is demonstrating that, like, hey, you talk to people like me all the time. I talk to CEOs of training organizations all the time, John. And it's really interesting what I hear from them, what I've been hearing from them over and over again, and how different that is from 12, 18, 24 months ago. Oh my gosh, it's crazy, right? So now you and I are having a conversation about what's been going on in the training world. As a CEO, like, what's going on at Pavilion? What's going on at MSP? What's going on at Sales Assembly? Because guess what? I was just talking to Jeff literally yesterday, right? So it's like I'm building a connection just based on some things that I'm sharing about personas, companies, industry-wide insights that I've just gathered because I've been talking to similar personas in similar industries, at similar stages over and over and over again. It's why one of the things that you always say when it comes to prospecting, focus on a persona in a industry for a week, right? Because then you don't have to context switch, and you can share what you've been learning in all of your conversations. Those things help you to build connections. And building connection, by the way, as I said, just takes some time. But if you start to showcase some credibility and you start to show some empathy, you're going to build that connection a hell of a lot faster, right?
I just thought of a small
and if you also think like, what can I give to this interaction, right? If I can give something to you that could be of value that maybe totally irrelevant. Yesterday, here's a cool example of this. Yesterday, CEO of Chili Piper, or co-founder of Chili Piper, Alina, was saying her customer success organization, they are empowered to do things outside of their regular job. So if they're talking to a customer and they find out that person's like mother is sick in the hospital with COVID, they have the power to actually send that person in the hospital if they're on hospital flowers.
Yeah, love that. Well, what was it? Was it Zoots, or who was the shoe? They're famous for it. There was a case study where Zappos. Yeah, they do that. Like, it was like, holy shit! Like, they literally go get somebody deliver pizza. It's like,
totally.
Like, this has nothing to do with shoes. Like, and they build their brand off of that. So that connection. One thing, the nuance I thought of with Chris Voss, right, with his never split the difference. One of the things I thought he said was really interesting is when you can reframe somebody's situation and frame it back to them, you listen for a small nuance here. After you say it, you're looking for a that's right versus that's you're right. if somebody says you're right, that's their play kit. Oh yeah, you're right. Yep, that's my problem. But if somebody's like, man, that's right, like that's right, you nailed it. Like there's the connection. So
yes, amen to that. Just remember, we're trying to do those 3 things because why? Because we're just having a conversation, right? Because that's what selling's all about. It's about having a series of conversations. Now the challenge is we struggle in these conversations because in the back of our head we realize like there's a lot of competition. And when you're talking, I think the important thing about understanding your buyers or your prospective buyers, you have to understand they have other priorities. They've got other problems to solve. They've got pressures that you have no idea what's going on. By the way, you also don't really what's going on in their personal life. Right. And they've got competitors that are sending them equal information that what you're trying to allocate or you're trying to share. So there's a lot happening on the buyer side. We think like, oh, I just reached out to you. Why aren't you responding? You shared some interest. You went to you went to a webinar. Why aren't you responding? Well, guess what? Me as a buyer, John, you as a buyer, have a lot of shit going on. Just saying that, right? Yep. And most importantly, the thing is, our biggest competitor, the thing that we're actually competing against the most, is the status quo. That's just it. Because the reality is, the status quo is safe. Yes. Do you know what's going on in the world today, right now? It's scary. Yeah. So as a buyer right now, I have to overcome this status quo bias. That is my job. In order for me to get comfortable and to be confident enough to build a business case with you to take up to my CFO, who is likely going to maybe between now and the end of the year, maybe make 1 or 2 big purchase decisions, I've got to overcome the status quo bias. And it's hard.
Have you read Jolt Effect yet?
I haven't read Jolt Effect yet, but I know that this is
it's this
is a big part of it.
They talk about how everybody talks about no decision, whatever. That's fine.
Yep.
But it's indecision because now it's the risk factor, right?
Dude, I love it.
Yeah, you got to listen to it. I picked it up the other day. You know, I'm not a reader here. I've read like 6 books.
Yeah,
the 6th one.
You and Jason Bateman.
Yeah, but that was one of those things where it was a light bulb because, I asked the question, for instance, everybody's good at reverse selling, right? Well, what do you want this January 1st? Great. When we reverse timeline, well, you got to sign today for January. And then I would say, well, ask the question, what happens if you don't launch on January 1st? What's the impact of the business? So that's no decision. But now I ask the question, hey, Doug, just out of curiosity, like, what's a bad decision look like for you here? Say you make the wrong choice. Totally. What does that look like?
Happens?
And then it's weird. It almost becomes like this therapy session where they start talking. They're like, oh man, fuck, if I make one more bad decision here, my ass is grass.
I'm out.
I'm done. And we're going to miss this and that. And now my job is to de-risk. Forget about feature function. Like I'm almost assuming like,
it's not about that.
Like
it's not about that.
But if I can de-risk this, because if I can make your staying status quo more risky, then moving. Now I can move you. But even if you're in a shitty situation, you're still not going to really take a risk because nobody got fired for not making decisions. People get fired for making bad decisions. And because it's analysis paralysis right now, and there's so much information out there, people are afraid to make decisions.
Totally, 100%. So I always say it's so interesting that you said it because I have been saying, you haven't necessarily heard this, but like for a really long time, our job in sales is to help our buyer just make a conscious decision. Because sticking with the status quo, most often, no decision, most often is subconscious. It's like, you know what? I can't deal with this right now. My boss just came to me with a new project. I'm freaked out. We just did a riff. I made it through. I'm not doing anything right now. So guess what? I made a subconscious decision to do nothing. And then you're going to pepper me with emails. And I'm just going to delete because I don't want to be reminded about the fact that it's probably a decision I may or may not want to make, but I just don't want to make it. So my job as a seller for you, the buyer, is actually quite complicated. Number one, got to make sure you feel like this is a conversation. Number two, got to build connection, demonstrate credibility, and showcase empathy. Number three, I need to call out the fact that there's a greater than 50% chance, John, that you and I in our conversations you're going to end up sticking with what you're currently doing. Yep. And you know what? Here's the thing. I'm okay with that so long as we're both aware of the fact that you've done this consciously. You've consciously chosen to stick with what you're currently doing. And if that's the case, cool.
Good for you.
Because then there's good reason behind it. Because together, you and I are going to unpack the risks, the fears, everything associated with making this decision. My job in sales is to help facilitate a decision, right? Consciously. Yeah. Because the reason why we lose to the status quo, we lose to no decision, is because it happens unconsciously. Yep. And so if you call this out in the beginning of the conversation, all of a sudden now you're like, I'm dropping my guard a little bit, because I'm like, oh, okay, this is interesting, especially if you talk to people like me all the time.
Yep.
Right. And so demonstrating some level of credibility and showing some empathy, it's like, okay, all right, I feel like you kind of get me. I kind of feel like you're on my side of the table now instead of the other side of the table.
Yeah, it's super funny. Like the small tactical thing I used to do was, like, in the beginning of a conversation, there was next steps and that type of stuff. I'd ask the client, hey, look, as we go through this process, if it's pretty evident to you that we're not a good fit, and I'm not seeing it for some reason because I got my rose glasses on and that type of thing, I would just be like, are you okay telling me no?
Yes.
I would just ask that, are you okay telling me no? And it was because, and I always say, look, obviously yes is the best answer in sales. No is the second best answer in the sales. And I don't want to maybe or no response, right?
Totally.
And if you maybe or no response me, you turn me into the stalker that neither one of us want, right?
Yes.
Then I do weird shit. I call you on weird times. I go around your head. Like, nobody wants that. So you okay with telling me no?
Totally.
And then you watch them relax a little bit. And the reason I used to do that a lot more was because it would set the stage for when they did ghost me. I could be like, hey, Doug, remember like when we talked earlier, like I told you I was okay with saying no. Like,
totally.
Yet, man. Like,
you kind of told me you weren't going to ghost me, and said you're going to tell me no. So I just don't want to read the tea leaves incorrectly.
Correct.
I don't want to make any assumptions here. So just a good reminder that, like, look, as a seller, if I'm talking to a prospect, I don't care at what stage, this could be brand new, initial call. It's like, look, the likelihood is you're going to end up sticking with what you're doing, especially right now. And secondarily, my job is to actually help you make a conscious decision, so that even if you do stick with what you're currently doing, you consciously made that decision, and you can feel good about it.
I love that.
Because guess what? Because the reality is this: more than 60% of our well-qualified opportunities end up in doing nothing. More than 60% of the time, your prospects are going to, like, even if they take it all over to the CFO, it's going to end up in sticking with the status quo, because there's reasons behind for it, psychological reasons. The reality is, though, what you need to do, the very first thing that I suggest to every single rep, is go through all of your existing pipeline and go, which deals are going to end up in that 60%? Just be honest. Just be like, highlight it. Be like, oof, all right, I just, like, which ones do I feel like might end up in that kind of no decision status quo? It's easier, safer, whatever it may be. The reason why this is really important is because it's going to help you with your forecast accuracy. It's also going to help you rethink your strategy. And why not call it out, by the way? Be like, hey, John, I just want to kind of want to level set some expectations. One, if we ever get to the point where it's just not a good fit, please, will you tell me no? And secondarily, my job is to help you make a conscious decision, because I know the likelihood is greater than 50% of the time it ends up in sticking with what you're currently doing. So let's just be honest about all this.